Good evening, everyone. My name is Stefan Schäfer. I'm a research group leader at the Research Institute for Sustainability at the GFZ Helmholtz Center for Geosciences in Potsdam, and also affiliated with IRETHESIS, the Integrative Research Institute for Transformations of Human Environment Systems here at Humboldt University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's KOSMOS lecture. The public lecture series KOSMOS-Lesungen carries on the tradition of Alexander von Humboldt's famous KOSMOS lectures, which he gave to students and the Berlin public in 1827 and 1828. While Humboldt sought to offer a comprehensive physical description of the world, today's KOSMOS-Lesungen focus on the interactions between the physical world and human behavior. Since 2019, the 250th anniversary of Humboldt's birth, IRETHESIS has regularly invited natural scientists, social scientists, and scholars from the humanities to Humboldt University, Berlin, to analyze planetary environmental change and provide insights into current research on transformation and sustainability. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Richard Balme for this evening's lecture. Richard Balme is professor of political science at Sciences Po in Paris, where he is affiliated with the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics. And over many years, he has developed a distinguished body of work in comparative politics, public policy, environmental governance, and international relations, with expertise spanning Europe, the United States, and China. His work is especially important because it approaches environmental politics and policy as fundamentally a question of institutions, statehood, and political order. Much of his research asks how different political systems confront environmental challenges and how forms of governance shape environmental policy outcomes. Tonight's lecture, The State and the Anthropocene, the Comparative Politics of Climate Institutions and Climate Policies, addresses a question that could hardly be more urgent. Why, despite decades of scientific knowledge and international agreements, climate governance continues to fall short of its own ambitions, and what this reveals about contemporary political institutions and forms of state power. So we are very fortunate to have him with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Balme.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I would like to start with a word of thanks for Axel Klee and Stefan Schäfer for the invitation tonight, for arranging this meeting, and for preparing comments or questions to follow my presentation. I'm also very happy to meet you and hope to have a chance to exchange with you after this presentation. I'm very lucky this year because for the first time and probably the last time in my academic career, I have the chance to benefit from what we call a sabbatical leave, meaning that I've been off from teaching for the entire year, which I could devote to my research and writing again after so many years of university administration and intensive teaching. So during this time, I decided not to move away, but to stay in Paris to work in my study room, in my office at Sciences Po, in my university. But I accepted the invitation of the Centre Marc Bloch, which is also affiliated with Humboldt University here, for a short-term visit for this month of May. And during this visit, I've been invited by Axel and IRETHESIS to join you for this presentation tonight. So very honored to be part of this prestigious KOSMOS lectures on a topic which is, of course, related to what Alexander von Humboldt tried to accomplish in establishing natural science, but also in touching on some aspects of social sciences. As some of you may know, he also wrote an essay on the limits of the state interventions, and which are a little bit beyond the scope of discussion of tonight, but very interesting to relate to all of this. So I consider my work as a political scientist to collect evidence, analysis, data, interpretation, in order to understand what we call politics, power structure, power behavior, and particularly institutions. I've been always interested by the interaction between social movements, collective action, people's behavior on the one hand, and institutions on the other hand. And I think one of the primary tasks of political science is to help to understand what kind of difference do institutions make. Institutions are not all equivalent. They can change the course of our lives, and we need to understand how and why. So with climate change, we have a relatively particular situation, but which is in a way relatively common in politics, where my colleagues from so-called hard science, natural sciences, often ask me, you're a political scientist, you're a social scientist, so how come, knowing what we know about climate change, how come nothing is happening? How come can't we fix it? There may be many reasons for that, but I think one of the major reasons can be institutions. We may not have the proper institutions to address climate change, and it is this relatively large perspective that I try to address with comparative politics and comparative political institution. So, to say it a little bit differently, this climate change issue is a sort of massive failure in a way. The world is aware of the risk of climate change, of the impact of climate change, but we don't fix it, or we fail to fix it. Market doesn't fix it. In a way, it's a market failure of global scale. You could say global capitalism is generating climate change and is unable to fix it. It's also a governance failure, a state failure, an international institutions failure, which are unable to, again, address the issue or at least fix it. Failure, when I use the term, I'm writing this here, is not exactly appropriate. It's unfair to say failure. Failure means here that we are not fixing the problem as we think or we know we should fix it. But it doesn't mean that nothing is happening. Quite the opposite. I think there's a substantial transformation of public policy and institution in response to climate change. Not enough, not fast enough, but again, this doesn't mean that nothing is happening, that this is not significant. But failure gives a sense of this normative deficit, in a way, of this gap between climate policy as we know it should be and as it is. So, understanding where does this gap come from, and assuming from my perspective that it comes in part from institutions, is the perspective I will defend here. One word about the Anthropocene. There are much debates about the Anthropocene. Is it a good category? Is it a bad category to characterize the age of the Earth we are living in? I take it as a strictly social science concept. So not to describe a physical or ecological materiality, but rather to describe the epoch, the area, the cognitive and political frame where public policy is understood with a new spatial scale. It needs to be of global scale. And a new temporal scale. We need to think of public policy for the end of this century. And there's also an ontological dimension behind this, which is the capacity, the habitability of the Earth, our capacity to live on the Earth. And this cognitive frame, this, you could say, moral and mental structure, is penetrating social sciences, becomes the new horizon of public policy and state action for the century. This gap between what should be done and what is done can come from many sources. Some of them could be policy preferences. In fact, we may sign international agreements or commit to policy objectives that would not reveal our true or the government's true policy preferences. So preferences may be, choices could be a source of this implementation gap. We could also have, and I strongly believe this is part of the explanation, a sort of disjunction between the definition of the problem, so the politics we use to define the problem of climate change, and then another politics where we address the issue of climate change and develop solutions to cope with it. And these two political arenas do not communicate very well with each other. Or we have this institutional perspective I will try to develop here, where institutions, state institutions primarily, probably serve as locking in energy consumption, consumers' behavior, firms' behavior, political behavior, as it is. Okay? So this is the, I'm fairly convinced that the reasons for this implementation gap are multifactorial, multidimensional and multifactorial. But let's focus for the sake of tonight on institutions. Okay, so institutions matter. This is a general perspective of neo-institutionalism in social sciences. They make a difference either by locking in social arrangements, supporting fossil fuel economies, or alternatively facilitating energy transitions, climate adaptation, and resilience. So I will first set the frame for an institutional analysis for climate policy, briefly present the three cases of state climate nexus with the cases of the EU, the US, and China, then present climate institutions and policies in the three cases in comparative perspective, then propose a characterization of varieties of climate policy regimes, and then conclude, if I still have time, we may save this for the discussion as well, on a few notes on showing institutions matter, yes, but how do they matter, and specifying a little bit this argument. So for those of you familiar with comparative politics and comparative social science, you will see will recognize that varieties of climate policy regimes refer to a whole stream of neo-institutionalist literature comparing welfare state regimes, which is classical work in public policy and comparative government. And this is at least from this inspiration that I borrowed the perspective developed here. So, how can we think about institutions and climate? In the literature, if you Google that, the term, or if you do some serious bibliographical research, you will find quite a large number of publications using the term climate institutions in fact, a relatively different meaning. So the term climate institutions is not very stabilized. Sometimes it refers to specific climate institutions, sometimes it refers to political institutions and their impact on climate, sometimes it refers to policy measures addressing climate issues, sometimes it even refers to the political economy structure of the country and its impact on policy, climate policy. So the field is not very stabilized, I would say. It comes from different inspiration, comparative politics and public policy, as I just said, law and economics, international political economy, and some very welcome interdisciplinary research where geographers, energy scholars, political scientists try to cooperate together to develop new instruments to understand energy transitions and low carbon transitions, which is a huge enterprise. I will focus here, my work this year focuses on national political institutions. It's relatively straightforward because when we think comparative politics, comparative governments, we usually think what we call cross-national comparative analysis. But there are other levels of comparative analysis. For instance, we could work on regional, subnational, city governments. We could work on supply chains. We could work on international agreements and compare them across regions. I leave all this aside to focus on what national governments do when they pretend to address climate change. Okay, to be a little bit analytical, climate policy, different from climate institutions, climate policy are policy instruments to address climate change through mitigation and adaptation strategies. I guess the terms are familiar to most of you. Mitigation strategies to curb down CO2 emissions, which is basically energy policy and phasing out of fossil fuels, or decarbonization of energy policy. And then adaptation policies, which are policies developed to react to climate change impact in events, protection of populations, insurance development, dams, extreme weather events, protection against extreme weather events. Okay, so these are in fact two entirely different policy areas. There's far less literature on adaptation than on mitigation, and I leave adaptation aside, at least for tonight, because it's a huge, it's another chapter, okay? Then if we look at instruments used in climate policy. Some of them are policy specific, designed to address climate change, and the two major instruments specific to climate policy, mitigation policies, are carbon taxes and emission trading schemes, so carbon markets. But there are many others which can be embarked in other sectoral policies or trade policies, agriculture policies, so regulations, standards, which are part of other policies, but can respond or address to climate change mitigation objectives. So policies, instruments, if we move to institutions, we refer to the organizations and governance arrangement responsible for decision-making, policy design, policy implementation in the domain of climate change. And again, sometimes they are very specific. They are designed explicitly to address climate change, but very often they are part of existing institutions, existing ministries, and precisely one of the difficulties is that when you search for climate policy, you need to identify where you can find it. and very often it's fragmented. It's cross-sectoral. It touches every policy sector, you could say. And therefore, it tends to be relatively fragmented, more or less, depending on political systems, countries, periods of time, but it tends to fragmentation. Okay. Moving on. These climate institutions, or the institutional dimensions of the climate issue, can be found at several levels. I will mention them here and then select only a few of them when we will start the comparison of the practical cases. But one dimension is the constitutional dimension. If I said in my introduction, I believe climate change issue is transforming political system, it is impacting political institutions. If it really does, the core of political institutions impacted by the issue is the constitution. And some countries, yes, address climate change in their constitution, acknowledge climate change in their constitutions, and others don't. Of constitutional rank, I would say, in public law or constitutional law, international treaties are also part of this hierarchy of norms in the political systems. And therefore, same thing, some countries obey, adhere, and implement international treaties regarding climate, and others don't. Okay, so constitution is the first dimension. Then we have a dimension which is what I call climate bureaucracy. So how do governments, the executive branches of the government, how do they manage the climate issue? Who does that? Is this the Ministry of the Environment? Is this the Ministry of Climate? Is this the Office of the Prime Minister, the President, a specific interministerial body? And what is the institutional engineering coming with climate change? And when you look at details, I won't cover details today, but if you look at details in the case of my own country, for instance, it goes a little bit back and forth. You know, when we change government, Well, for a period of time, energy is under the authority of the Ministry of the Environment, and then it comes back to the Ministry of Industry, and this institutional traveling has some impact on climate policy. Okay, so what is the executive, the bureaucratic machinery organized to deal with climate? That's the second important aspect. Then we have climate democracy or climate politics more generally. Well, for instance, in France, you may remember, some of you may remember that after the Yellow Vest movement a few years ago, Emmanuel Macron decided to organize a citizens' conference, a big public debate, inviting citizens randomly selected to make proposals to address climate policy. This is that was an institutional creation. That was a contribution to what we may call a form of climate democracy, mobilizing citizens for. It's not necessarily democracy, it can be authoritarianism, it can be political conflict, it can be more technocratic in a way. But there's some politics behind this, and it has it depends on institutions, and it can create some institutions as well. Then we have climate finance, which is probably very important for public policies. I will not detail that today because I don't have the data, I'm not ready to do it yet. But of course, it's a major policy lever for orienting investment in carbon versus non-carbon fossil fuels and energies. Climate justice, I guess the term is relatively familiar to many as well. So climate change comes with some inequalities. We know that environmental issues and climate issues in particular are more harmful for poor people, lower class people, and minority people than they are for rich and majority people. That is the case for the impact of environment, but it can also be the case of climate policy. So do governments take this into consideration and introduce measures to attenuate these inequalities, to manage these inequalities? This is also an important question. Then there can be sectoral climate institutions or climate instruments. If you think, for instance, of airline transportation or maritime transit, or, they are not under the jurisdiction of any single government. They are managed by international organizations. And these international organizations can develop specific tools, organizations, instruments to cope or not with climate change. Again, I'm not going to cover that. I'll talk a little bit about territorial governance because climate policy implementation has a strong territorial dimension. And particularly, fossil fuel production is not evenly distributed across territories. It's very associated or located in the places where fossil fuel resources are situated. And therefore, countries, regions, cities are very differently affected by energy transitions. And that, again, can be part of the institutional design, of the framing of the issue on the one hand, of the framing of the policy, and of its implementation. Okay, one word about, so this is the framework, and tonight we're not going to cover everything, a selection of a few major elements in the comparative perspective, but I hope to be able to consider everything later on. And one point about the impact of climate policy in comparative analysis, it's in fact difficult to establish causal relations between institutions and public policies, and public policy effects in particular. Okay, it can be done, but it necessitates extensive data, extensive research, and it's much more complex than what we usually assume. Yeah? So generally speaking, this impact institutional impact can be positive or negative, and it can be strong or weak or insignificant. So trying to identify this is extremely important. And to be specific in policy analysis, which we are not very spontaneously very rigorous in our everyday conversation about politics and policy making, but in the policy literature, we distinguish between policy outputs and policy outcomes. Outputs being what the government does as a result of the policy decision-making process, and outcomes being what is the impact of these outputs. So adopting a climate law, for instance, or an ETS, an emission trading system, is a political decision which is a political output, the outcome of which will be CO2 emission reductions or not. Okay, so the two are not the same, and the relation between the two is often difficult to really specify, causally specify. Okay. Institutions and instruments and policies do not float in the air. They are not distributed perfectly evenly, I would say. They come in packages. And what we observe are some form of governance mechanisms where we have packages of institutions and instruments which are more easily observable than institutions strictly defined. Okay, so as a political scientist, I want to know if a parliamentary regime is a better form of political institutions for climate change than a presidential regime, if referendum help for climate change policy, if authoritarianism can have a climate policy, if decentralization is better for climate policy or not, and so forth. So I try to do this for the three cases of the EU, China, and the USA. And to set the scene for these three cases, let me first say that decarbonization strategies depend on a number of structural factors. Development, which comes with energy demand. Low-level countries with lower level of development will need more energy in the future to build the infrastructures in their countries and to allow people to consume more energy than what they are doing. Local climate and weather conditions matter as well. Some countries have more extreme variations in temperature than others. And some countries also have more available energy resources and are more easily self-sufficient in their energy consumption than others. And when we think of energy mix, energy transition, energy choices, I think we need to have in mind that these energy mix are structured over time. So, and that time has a history, you could say, has a structuring effect on energy policy and energy consumption in the different countries, and therefore in the possibility of climate policy in each of these countries. And this is the relatively common figure of the development of energy use since the Industrial Revolution. You can see that the different fuels and energy sources add to each other, with traditional biomass, meaning wood, at the bottoms. So, say, early 19th century, people would use quasi-exclusively wood for energy, to which has been added coal, to which has been added oil, starting early 20th century, but mostly after the middle of 20th century, to which has been added natural gas, to which has been added nuclear and wind and solar and modern biofuel. So we are in the very last, when we talk about renewables, we're talking about a small proportion of additional energy sources in the very last seconds of contemporary history, you could say, not to speak of ancient history. But of course, this matters. You know? this timeline matters. If you enter development, at what point in time do you enter development? It matters for countries, and for countries accessing development today have access to some renewable energy technologies which were not present in the past. Okay. So look at this, energy use per person in our three cases. You can see that first, United States consumes much more energy per person than the European Union, and this is in part related to lifestyles, policy choices, American way of life, you could say, versus European way of life, so more urban density and population density in Europe than in the US, but it's also related to climate, where there's no Gulf Stream in North America. There's no Gulf Stream in China as well, so winter are harsher and summer are hotter than what they are in Europe, and this has an impact on energy consumption. And you can see that in the last period, so since economic modernization of China started in 1978, but quickly accelerating at the beginning of the 21st century, China energy consumption per capita has been growing very fast. Okay, and this comes with development. This is not by chance. This is the impact of development. And correlatively, CO2 emissions follow the same pattern. Just notice that energy consumption per capita decreases in the US and in the European Union since the beginning of the century, you could say. But they continue to grow, energy demands continue to grow in China. Same thing for annual CO2 emissions. They continue to grow in China, or they have continued to grow until now in China. And they slightly declined since 1990 for the European Union and 2000 for the US, a little bit later in the US. Per capita terms, we follow the same pattern. And a result of that is that as the Chinese economy is growing, not the population, but the economy is growing, China now represents 30% of world CO2 emissions, while we are 77% for the European Union and 12% for United States. Now, in terms of energy resources availability and self-sufficiency, what you can see here in gray are the energy imports for the US. And you can see that since the beginning of the century, the US has developed a strategy to become more and more self-sufficient, and the country is self-sufficient in energy consumption. This is not the case at all for the EU, where the situation is exactly the opposite. Energy self-sufficiency in the EU has been declining since the beginning of the century and is below 50%. So it makes a big difference in global politics, right? And this is China, where China is actively working to comfort and develop its energy self-sufficiency, and is more self-sufficient despite the massive imports of fossil fuels in China, is more self-sufficient than the EU, much more, okay? The dark green is coal consumption in the country. So you can see it's still very high in energy consumption. Okay. Well, I'll skip this, just mentioning just briefly indicating that despite what is sometimes suggested with China as a champion of energy transition, yeah, let's look at this. China is also a massive fossil fuels consumer, producer, importer. Okay? So this is true for oil, this is true for gas, and this is true for coal, naturally. So, champion of renewable, yes, but added to massive fossil fuel consumptions. Let's try to compare this situation being the setting being identified. Let's try to compare the policy objectives, the commitments, the policy outputs related to climate. Sorry. Now, it's a little bit technical and tedious to look at it in detail, but if we look at CO2 emission reductions for the EU, the plan is to reduce emissions by at least 55% by by 2030, compared to 1990, and to reach net zero emissions by 2050. The US had relatively similar commitments with a different timeline for the commitment, but with the objective of reaching net zero emissions by 2050 with the Biden administration. But as you probably know, the Trump administration has withdrawn for the second time of the Paris Agreement and actively dismantles any kind of decarbonization objectives and starkly orients itself to fossil fuel expansions. China is committed to reach an emission peak by 2030, so to curb carbon emissions by 2030, and to reach net zero emission by 2060, so 10 years later than the European Union. According to analysts, the peak in CO2 emissions is probably accomplished already. Okay? China CO2 emissions have slightly declined last year with the last data we have. And this is not the first time they decline, but according to analysts, this is the first time they decline because of decarbonization of the energy mix. Okay. Remains to be seen if this is consolidated already or if it will be stabilized, and then how fast the decline will occur, because this is still, in all cases, this is still massive amount of CO2 emissions, and we need to phase them down, really down, you know. Okay, so how fast will it go? And here the commitment taken by China, Xi Jinping said they would be reduced between 7 and 10% below peak levels by 2035, and all analysts seem to agree that this is too few, very few and too few. That being said, Chinese authorities have this strategy, you could say, of announcing achievable commitments in order to make sure to fulfill them. Okay, so there are good chance to think that results will be better than this, but the commitment is pretty low. Okay, I'm not going to detail the rest. If we look at policy instruments, EU has the most stringent commitments, I would say. It also has an emission trading system since 2005, a carbon tax, CBAM, at the border, active since the beginning of this year, and an EU climate law with the binding targets for member states, which is active since 2021, and where targets progressively tend to become more stringent, subject to political fluctuations around the Parliament and the Commission. Okay, in the US, even with the Biden administration, there was no ETS system at the federal level. There are several at the local level, but not at the federal. There is no carbon tax at the federal level, and there's no comprehensive climate legislation at the federal level either. And for China, yes, there is an ETS system since 2021. There's no carbon tax, and there is a relatively stringent environmental and ecological code, which is which has been recently adopted, where climate objectives are incorporated into legislation. Part of these instruments is industrial policy, and I cannot go through the detail, but quickly speaking, for the EU, this is the Green Deal, and the different documents setting its industrial strategy. In the US, the Biden administration has had a strong industrial policy with the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, plus a number of others. But again, the Trump administration has rolled that out completely. So this does not exist anymore. Okay. And for China, we have the infamous 5-year plans, where industrial policy and green development are enshrined in the plan, in the different plans, since the 11th plan, so several 5-year plans consecutive, with more stringent objectives progressively. And now we have this policy of the new 3 leading sectors for export-driven growth: solar products, lithium batteries, and new energy vehicles. Okay. I stop 1 second on the emission trading systems. This is very interesting. We're talking 5-year planning, so a policy process which is clearly from Soviet inspiration. Okay? But the instruments are market-based instruments. So statecraft, the way the Chinese government exerts political authority and changes behavior in the field of economy, is very much rooted in market instruments. And you can see here that overall the China ETS system covers more emissions than the one of the EU, which is somewhat surprising. You could think market instruments will be more developed in Europe and in the US than in China, but in fact, no. So how does this translate in policy outputs? Well, outputs we see here are outputs, I would say, from the Democrat administration in the US. There was Trump 1 administration, but we don't see yet the impact of Trump 2, which will probably be very significant. Well, we can discuss that, but anyway. Okay, so in China, it's not CO2 emissions which have been significant as a result so far. It's energy intensity that we're going to see in a minute. But in the United States and the European Union, I think what is interesting is that the 2 curves are relatively parallel. So we have different policy instruments, different settings, but basically if we measure change in CO2 emissions, not the levels, they are higher, still higher in the US, that's okay. But the way they change, policies, different policies, different instruments do not seem to make much difference. Energy intensity, this globally, this is improving. How much energy do we need to produce one unit of GDP? Generally speaking, less and less. We have more efficient energy systems, more efficient technology, so we're doing cleaner. or not so dirty, we could say. Yeah? And China is doing cleaner faster than others. So in a way, catching up, cleaning its energy system. And the same is true for the carbon intensity of growth. So how many carbon do you need to produce 1 unit of growth? You see the curve for China, which is more steeply than in the 2 other cases. And this is because of the phasing down, I don't want to say phasing out, but phasing down of coal in the electricity power generation. And what about renewables? This is the share of primary energy consumption from low carbon sources. So that there could be other data to check, but other indicators to check, but this one is interesting. How much from primary energy consumption comes from low carbon sources? And there you can see that it's growing. It's growing in the European Union, it's growing in China, it's growing in the United States, and it's growing fast in China. But in the end, China is nearly at the same level as the US and below the EU. So the clean case among the 3 is the EU, it's not China. However, when we look at installed capacity of renewables, well, the installed capacity of China is often said, but there's more renewable energy in China than in the entire rest of the world. So this is always the case with China because numbers are mind-boggling, but it's true. So you can see the difference between, say, China and the US, and then you have European countries that could not find the EU for this within this data set, but the EU has 600, around 600 gigawatts, if I remember well. So somewhere between China and the US, more than in the US, but 3 times less than China. Right? And on top of that, and maybe more significant, we have the share of our 3 cases, China, US, EU, within green technology, clean energy technology. And here, the dark green is China. So China is largely hegemonic for batteries, solar PVs, wind, a little bit less for electrolyzers and heat pumps. Then the light blue is the United States, and the light green is the European Union, where the EU has some part of wind, some part of batteries, but very small, right? And then if we look at refined minerals, critical minerals, same thing, you can see this massive green color, which represents the hegemony of China on graphite, rare earth, cobalt, lithium. Not so much on copper, but still with important shares of all these minerals essential to energy transitions. Let's go back to institutions. We have policy outcomes, policy outputs, a map of policy outputs. So what about institutions in the 3 cases? First, if we look at the constitutional dimension of institutions, in the US, there's none. the US Constitution is very difficult to amend, and there is no amendment referring to the environment or climate in the Constitution. Plus, the US did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol and withdrew twice from the Paris Agreement. So basically, there's no constitutional protection of climate policy in the US, and this is important. In the EU, climate and the environment are mentioned in Article 191 of the Treaty of the European Union. Kyoto and Paris agreements have been signed and ratified. So what does it mean? Assuming we had Donald Trump as president of the European Commission, he would need to change the European Treaty to roll back climate policy. So that would be, there's a constitutional protection of climate policy, because the Commission is accountable for implementing policies addressing the climate issue. He could not just ignore them and reject them, okay? And in China, we're not talking about constitutional government in the liberal sense of the term, but there is a constitution in China and a hierarchy of norms in China. And climate policy is asserted as part of the accomplishment of ecological civilization, which is enshrined in the constitution of the Communist Party of China, enshrined in the constitution of the country, and enshrined, most importantly, in Xi Jinping thought. So in China, you have study centers about Xi Jinping thought, explaining students that to follow Xi Jinping thought, we need to accomplish ecological civilization and through decarbonization and climate policy. Okay, so the policy is of very high rank in the normative apparatus of the regime. And this is where the comparison is interesting in a way. But then if we look at bureaucracy, the European Commission has monopoly of initiative in this area. There's a lot of, I would say, miscoordination, but also of coordination instruments going on in this area, coordination efforts going on in this area. Rather than when you compare this with the US, everything is under the authority of the President of the United States, and he was able to roll back this policy with few obstacles by the Congress or federal courts. So environment and climate policy in the US they are in a way protected by courts and legislation with important environmental litigation, but they are also very much executive. The president can dispose of it very easily. And in China, there was, until the energy law adopted in 2024, a lot of miscoordination between different departments, who is in charge of climate, energy, environment, and so forth. The key formulating institution is the NDRC. For those familiar with China, this is an important service and bureau under the authority of the civil government. But when Xi Jinping came in power, he created a number of leading small groups to strengthen policy coordination in all sectors, and climate neutrality fell under one of these groups. Climate politics, one word about climate politics. I would say very pluralistic in the EU, diverging views among member states, diverging views and polarization in the European Parliament, climate and environment, civil society and NGOs, business lobbies, green and brown, you know. So a lot of political interactions around climate politics. In the US, the federal structure of the country and the bipartisan system favors a form of polarization of the issue. So when you look at public opinion data, the US public opinion is worried about climate change, but is more divided than European public opinions on policy addressing climate change and transition policy and decarbonization in particular. So this polarization favors partisan competition and nourishes this situation where we are today, with one party proposing to roll back climate policy entirely. In China, public opinion is not exists, but it's not divided in the same way. It adheres to the objective of ecological civilization. So there's a form of environmental patriotism around the climate and environmental issues that you can read in public opinion. And there's also few or no channels for civil society, interest groups, coal workers, and so forth to express their voice in the regular policy process. There are some protests in coal mining regions when coal mines are closed, but they are not channeled by the regular political system. They're relatively eruptive and suppressed by Chinese authorities. Okay, bon. There was some elements of climate justice with the Biden administration. They are gone. There are important ones in Europe, certainly not sufficient, but in comparative perspective, very advanced. There's no other regions where you can find this. And in China, no. There's no compensation for workers losing their job because coal mines are shut down. No, this kind of things does not exist. My colleagues, experts, start to recognize to discuss about just transitions, because we're talking millions of jobs in China around coal. Millions and millions. So they start to discuss it, but this is not part of the official language, official policy documents, and so forth. And to conclude with the territorial relations, center-periphery relations, if you want, well, it's in Europe that the policy is the most integrated between the EU level and the member states because of the binding commitments of the climate law of 2021. So the policy is reviewed, revised, reinforced, and member states are committed to it. That does not exist in the US. There are some climate policies at the state levels, and relatively important ones in Massachusetts, in California. The Chinese colleagues I met in Beijing in last October, for instance, I asked them, so what's happening now about climate with the Trump administration? And they told me, well, we discussed with the Democratic Party and with California. Okay, so you know, it means things are still going on in a way. Some things are still going on in a way, okay? So states have the capacity to push and develop their own policies up to a certain point, because I was astonished to learn that Donald Trump has actually commissioned the Department of Justice to sue some states in order that they roll back their climate policy. So this is a very significant fact, but it gives an idea of the tensions and of the competitive federalism around climate which is occurring in the US. And in China, as you know, China is a unitary state with a strong hierarchical structure, which is the Communist Party of China. So local provincial leaders are under the authority of the party, assessed according to their performances, including on climate, and promoted or removed according to this. So in Shanxi province, for instance, which is a coal mining province, the governor has been removed because, or sanctioned because he was not closing coal mines fast enough. Okay. So some elements of, but when we think of China, sometimes in the literature the term environmental federalism is used in China, but China is certainly not a federal state. It's what we see at the provincial level is it's a decentralized unitary state. Okay. Okay, so this bureaucratic centralism and tournament system is also an asset because it gives authority to top-down authority in the implementation of the climate policy. But top-down in implementation also has its limits, I would say. Okay, so to sum up, and I will leave it here. I have a couple of more slides, but we can keep them for the discussion. If we try to summarize different climate regimes, I see the EU, however critical we may be about Green Deal and implementation and environmental backlash in the EU, but overall, a political system actively transitioning with difficulties to decarbonization, with an integrated multi-level system of governance, some elements of climate justice, and materials, fuels and minerals, technological dependency, shifting from the US to China. Very important, this element, of course. In the US, what we have is a forward-backward climate policy, on-off, intermittent. When it's active, it's nearly as effective, maybe with less climate justice than in the EU, but it's effective in CO2 emission reduction. In the end, this competitive federalism we'll have to see in the coming years if what the federal government does really makes a difference or not. If we see the same CO2 reduction than we had before, it's because states do it, not the federal government, but we will know. And then, but at present, the US administration has decided to become a fossil fuel giant, sovereign, exporting power through its fossil fuel influence. And in China, we have a consistent and robust climate policy through decarbonization of the energy sector with renewable energy and electric vehicles, industrial policy very active. This development of clean energy is more additional than substitutive with fossil fuels, which remain massively important. And the regime remains technocratic, authoritarian, domestically, but gains a lot of traction and a lot of influence overseas through energy investments along the Belt and Road Initiative, around energy technology exports, and also around fossil fuel consumption, because China is an important buyer for Russia, for Iran, for Saudi Arabia, and so forth. So this is where we are. This is how I think we can characterize these institutional settings and the articulation with climate policy trajectories and outputs. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions and comments for the discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Richard, for this very insightful comparative analysis of very rich data from these three important players, the United States, Europe, and China in climate policy. And also for the climatic regimes or the climate policy regimes that they've been building and in part dismantling again recently. So we have now time for, I'd say, probably 2 to 3 questions. If someone in the audience would like to, I see 2 coming up immediately, so I'll just go by proximity to me, 1, 2, and I see Hilton as well, that's 3 already. Okay, so we'll take you first and then a quick response, and if both the questioners and the respondent can be concise, we'll manage to get to all of them.
Okay. So I'll try. I thank you very much for the interesting comparison. I want to make more comment and then combine it with a question. And this is because I come from what you call the hard science. I've been active in applied research in chemistry for more than 3 decades. And in 2017, there was a study by the Association of the Chemical Industry of Germany. And they investigated what has to be done in the field of chemical industry in order to get to net zero at 2050. And there is a number of very interesting outcomes of the study. One is chemical industry by itself cannot make it. There needs to be some, let's say, coordinating body above it, because chemical industry is kind of the basis for all material production, and in order to really get it done, there needs to be a coordination with other industries. This is what's more interesting. Currently, chemical industry requires some 10% of our electrical energy production. If we completely convert it to green energy, we need 4 times our whole current energy production, meaning 10% today, 400% in 2050. This is just to give you an imagination about the scale of what needs to be done there. And this brings me to my actual question. Since China is known as the fabric of the world, so a lot of industrial production, material production has been shifted from Europe, from US to China during the last, let's say, 30 years. I didn't see that you took care for these shifts because this might be dramatic in the numbers you presented here with respect to energy consumption per capita and these kind of things. Could you please comment on that?
Thank you very much for your question, very interesting question. Regarding this question of trade and emissions and European disindustrialization and relocation of industries in China, the numbers indicate that territorial emissions in China are, I would say, slightly less than 20% above consumption emissions, meaning that 80% of emissions coming from China are from domestic consumptions. They are not related to export. Okay? Now, this 20% is a big number. This 20% is a big number. And if you reverse the picture in Europe, we import the emissions we emit in consuming are lower than the one that our total emissions, and we import, I think, around 10% of these emissions. Okay, so the numbers exist, but they are not that big. The scale is relatively important. It's not the majority of emissions in China and in the developing world which are related to export and trade. It's a significant portion, but a small portion, a minority. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the other aspect, in a way related to what you're saying, is that the Chinese authorities are the current 15th five-year plan for the driving policy until 2030 is very much oriented towards the what is called in the Chinese debate, as reported by my colleagues, involution, meaning getting margin of growth from the domestic market, not from export, but facilitating growth within the market. So improving the quality of the quality of the domestic market. And so growth related to infrastructure, this is behind us. Chinese cities are done. Chinese airports, Chinese freeways, Chinese high-speed trains. Most of this is done. So the level of emissions will slow down because of this infrastructure phase of development, which is over now.
Okay, the gentleman in the back, and I'd like to combine two questions, please, for to make sure we end on time. So, yes, and then here in front after that.
Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. My question is a little bit related to the first one, but just a little slight change. In relation to the first one, it had to do with consumer-based accounting, but I'll make it a bit short. With about 1 to 5 products that are exported to EU coming from China, or 21% of its export, to what extent does consumer-based accounting attribute to better values in consumer emissions than the normally used production-based accounting.
Yeah, so I had a question. I'm a postdoc at the Research Institute for Sustainability and also doing comparative work, but I was kind of interested just in thinking about the three cases and the extent to which different institutional cultures might really matter, so the ways in which these countries have historically thought about specifically the relationship between the state and citizens. So I thought an interesting thing that you showed both in the EU and the China case was the sort of acceptance that the government can make plans and sort of strategize into the future in particular ways, which I think is quite different from the US case, where traditionally a lot of those things have been left to, I mean, this laissez-faire idea that you leave it to the markets to really decide. And so the markets are choosing one thing at one point and a very different thing at another point. So I guess I'm kind of interested how you see the differences as playing out across the sort of old world, new world divide, that the US really seems to believe that technology and markets can solve the problems, whereas in these other institutional landscapes, whether it's kind of the centralized model of China or the multi-level model of the European Union, how that might make a difference in terms of your institutional argument.
Thank you very much. To try to answer to your question, I'm aware of this question of consumption versus production-based emissions, but honestly, when you check at the figures, to me, it doesn't make a big difference. As I said, there's a 10 to 20% difference in the curves, but if you incorporate this in EU emissions, the picture is not radically different. But again, it needs to be acknowledged and accounted, but I think it is. In my view, it is. And for the comparative perspective you address, yes, of course, it's an entirely different political and administrative culture, policy strategy. In the US, energy policy is largely left to the market and to entrepreneurs, and there is a very strong culture of this. So energy entrepreneurs are very reluctant to see regulation coming in. They tend to. I remember attending some panel discussion at Columbia University, and energy business leaders claiming, well, energy production, we know how to do it. The government doesn't know. Let's us do it, and keep your regulation away. And if the market wants oil, we will produce oil, and when the markets will be ready for renewables, this is what we're going to do. But if you try to manipulate things, it's going to collapse. You're going to damage the entire industry in trying to do good. So let us do it. And in China, of course, it's not at all this perspective. Xi Jinping is able to convey business leaders in vast lecture halls and ask them to do what needs to be done to serve their country and to be loyal to their political leader. And yeah, it makes a big difference. What I find particularly interesting is that I think for Chinese authorities, it has always been a political project, a state-led project, political, economic development, energy security, energy access, building the country. This is a state affair. It's not the market who's going to do that. The state uses the market to do that. I think what is striking is that we may have thought, we may have hoped that with development, with the introduction of market in China, the society and the political system would progressively liberalize. And that did not happen. It could have happened, but it didn't happen. Okay. So now we have this sort of we're in Berlin, so I can use the term ordoliberalism in Beijing, where an authoritarian governance uses market instruments, uses market development in order to serve political goals, and at least in its own mind, public goods. And the interesting, I believe, is that Europe is a little bit caught up between the two. Europe is primarily a market, a common and single market, but not that efficient compared to the US market. In a way, the energy market in Europe faces rather similar challenges as the one in China. Interconnectedness, market prices to exchange, to produce electricity and to sell electricity from one province to the other. So market institutions are an issue on both sides, and in a way, an instrument for development. But the big difference is that as the Chinese government is very centralized, very, I would say, determined, very consistent, and very unitary, it is able to develop an industrial policy which Europe so far, the European Union, has failed to do in the recent periods. So this is where we are, I believe. But the three cases are interesting to put in this perspective. Thank you.
Maybe a small addition. Xi Jinping is a chemical engineer, so compare it to European.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you'll join us again next week when we'll already have the next Cosmos lecture. Next week we'll have Professor Sabine Fuß speaking on the potential and challenges of CO2 removal, same time, same place, a week from today. And for today, thank you again, Professor Balme, for speaking to us and for your insights. And thank you all for being here. And have a nice rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention and questions. Okay.